In the summer of 1967, a 24-year-old man locked himself inside a Los Angeles recording studio and quietly gave up on the most ambitious album of his life. No press conference. No explanation. He simply stopped. The tapes sat in boxes for 37 years, and for decades, almost no one outside his inner circle understood why. The world knew Brian Wilson as the boy genius who had turned surfboards and hot rods into a sound so lush it rewired what pop music could be. What almost no one knew, in that moment, was that the sound in his head had started working against him. By his early 20s, Wilson had already done what most musicians never do once. He had written, arranged, and produced hit after hit for the Beach Boys, a band he had built with his two younger brothers, a cousin, and a childhood friend, in the garage of his family's home in Hawthorne, California. He was not the frontman. He rarely wanted to be. He was the architect, the one hearing full orchestral arrangements in his head before anyone else in the room could hear anything at all. Critics would later call him one of the most significant songwriters of the 20th century. In 1966, that reputation was still being built, one impossible session at a time. But the rise had a cost that started showing itself years earlier than most fans realized. In December 1964, mid-flight to a tour date, Wilson broke down completely. He couldn't continue. He stepped off the road for good after that, choosing instead to stay behind and write and produce while the rest of the band toured without him. It was framed, at the time, as a practical decision, the studio genius staying home to work his magic in peace. It was also the first visible sign of something deeper, something that wouldn't have a name for years. What came next looked, from the outside, like an unstoppable ascent. Freed from the road, Wilson poured everything into the studio. He assembled some of the finest session musicians in Los Angeles. He stacked harmonies in ways no one in rock music had attempted. The result, in 1966, was an album so meticulously built that it would go on to be studied in music schools decades later. It made him, by every outward measure, the most celebrated young producer in American pop music. And yet even as the acclaim built, something was already shifting underneath it. Those closest to him began noticing changes. In his sleep, his mood, the voices he described hearing that no one else could. He kept working. He kept building. But the man constructing the most sophisticated pop music of his generation was, at the very same time, beginning to lose his grip on the world around him. What happened next would nearly cost him everything he had built, and it started with an album he believed would be his masterpiece. By early 1966, Brian Wilson stood at the absolute peak of his powers. The album he had just finished, built around themes of love, loss, and longing rather than surfboards and convertibles, stunned even his harshest critics. Musicians on the other side of the Atlantic took notice immediately. Paul McCartney would later say it pushed the Beatles to raise their own game. For a 23-year-old who had never taken a formal composition class, it was a staggering validation. Wilson wasn't just keeping pace with the biggest band in the world. He was pulling ahead of it. Commercially, though, the album underperformed in the United States on release, confusing a label and a fan base that had grown used to songs about cars and beaches. Wilson didn't retreat from that disappointment. He doubled down. He began work on something even more audacious, a follow-up he described as a teenage symphony to God, built in fragments, modules, and movements rather than conventional verses and choruses. He brought in a young lyricist, Van Dyke Parks, whose surreal, literary wordplay was unlike anything else on American radio. The working title was Smile. The sessions became legendary before the album ever existed. Wilson recorded animal sounds, built fires in buckets inside the studio for atmosphere, and layered vocal parts with an obsessiveness few producers had ever attempted. He wasn't just chasing a great record anymore. He was chasing something closer to a religious experience, and the pressure of holding that vision together, largely inside his own head, was enormous. Studio musicians who worked with him during this period later described a man who was brilliant and increasingly erratic in the same afternoon. The warning signs, in hindsight, were already there. Wilson had begun using drugs recreationally, and their effects on someone already prone to anxiety and mood instability were not fully understood by anyone around him, including Wilson himself. He described hearing voices, critical, intrusive, unrelenting, as early as 1965, a detail he would only speak about publicly many years later. At the time, those around him chalked up his behavior to eccentricity, to genius, to the ordinary strangeness of an artist working at the edge of what he understood. Nobody around him had the vocabulary yet for what was actually happening. Meanwhile, tension inside the band itself was quietly building. Not everyone shared Wilson's appetite for abandoning the Surf and Cars formula that had made them famous. Some band members were uneasy with Park's abstract lyrics and skeptical the new album would ever be finished, let alone embraced by their audience. Wilson pressed on anyway, recording piece after piece, convinced he was building something that would outlast every record he'd made before it. He had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the album consuming him would also become the thing that broke him. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were simply being mistaken, by everyone including Wilson, for the ordinary strain of making something extraordinary. That mistake would not last much longer. By the spring of 1967, the album that was supposed to crown Brian Wilson's career had become something closer to a trap. The modular recording process that once felt liberating now felt impossible to finish. Wilson had recorded dozens of fragments, some brilliant, some abandoned mid-take, and he found himself unable to assemble them into a coherent whole. He compared it, years later, to putting together a puzzle on a wall instead of a table. Nothing stayed fixed, nothing felt complete. He believed he needed at least another year to finish it properly. He also believed, correctly, that no one would give him that time. The pressure compounded from every direction at once. Capitol Records wanted a follow-up. Some band members had grown openly doubtful the new material would connect with fans. And Wilson's own mental state, already fragile for years, was deteriorating under the weight of a project he could no longer control. The auditory hallucinations he had quietly lived with since 1965 grew harder to manage. Drug use, rather than easing the strain, made his grip on reality less stable, not more. He was still only 24 years old, and the architecture he had built in his mind was starting to come apart faster than he could hold it together. Then, without a formal announcement, he stopped. Sometime in mid-1967, Wilson simply walked away from the album. There was no single dramatic breakdown captured on film, no headline moment the public could point to. He later described it in far quieter terms, an admission to himself that he could not finish what he had started, at least not in the way he had envisioned it. In its place, the band hastily assembled a scaled-down record from some of the same sessions, released that September under a different name. It sold modestly. It satisfied Capitol's contract. It did nothing to explain to the public what had actually happened to the ambitious symphony everyone had been anticipating. What followed was not a single collapse but a slow, prolonged withdrawal. Wilson stopped touring with the band entirely years earlier, and now he began retreating from the studio too. He would still contribute pieces here and there over the coming years, but the relentless drive that had produced albums at a staggering pace began to fade. By the early 1970s, he had become something close to a recluse, rarely leaving his home, his weight and health both declining sharply. The man who once assembled entire orchestras from memory in his head was now, by his own family's later accounts, struggling to get out of bed most days. The public still didn't have a name for what was happening to him. Fans speculated about drugs, about eccentricity, about an artist who had simply burned out too fast. The truth was more specific and more serious than any of that. Wilson was living with a mental illness that would not be accurately diagnosed for years, compounded by substance abuse and a support system that had no idea how to help him. His unfinished album became legend, whispered about and bootlegged for decades. But the man behind it had disappeared from view almost entirely, and the person who would eventually step into that void would not be a doctor with his best interests at heart, but someone who saw an opportunity in exactly how lost Brian Wilson had become. By the mid-1970s, Brian Wilson's decline had become impossible for his family to ignore. His weight had ballooned past 300 pounds. He rarely left his Bel Air home. Concerned that conventional treatment wasn't reaching him, his then-wife Marilyn made a decision that seemed, at the time, like a last resort to save his life. She hired a psychologist named Eugene Landy, known for an unconventional approach he called 24-hour therapy, in which the therapist embedded himself directly into a patient's daily existence rather than meeting for scheduled sessions. At first, it appeared to work. Landy got Wilson out of bed, off the worst of his drug use, and back into something resembling a functioning life. But the arrangement that followed was not therapy in any conventional sense. Landy gradually inserted himself into every corner of Wilson's world. His finances, his relationships, his creative output, even songwriting credits on Wilson's music. What began as intervention hardened into control. Landy didn't simply treat Brian Wilson. Over the following years, he became his gatekeeper, his business partner, and by Wilson's own later accounts, something closer to a captor than a caregiver. This arrangement stretched on for roughly 15 years. During that stretch, Wilson released music, made occasional public appearances, and to much of the outside world appeared to be a recovery story. The reality inside that relationship was far darker. Wilson would later describe a controlling, isolating dynamic in which Landy dictated who he could see, what he could do, and how his finances were managed, profiting directly from his patient's continued dependency. It took Wilson's family and legal intervention to finally break the arrangement. In 1991, Landy's license to practice had already been revoked, and Wilson obtained a restraining order that finally ended his direct involvement. Landy died in 2006, having never faced the full consequences many around Wilson believed he deserved. Freed from Landy's control, Wilson's health did not immediately stabilize. He was, by this point, in his late 40s, having lost nearly 2 decades to addiction, breakdown, and manipulation. But something else had also happened during those lost years, something that had gone largely undiagnosed the entire time. Doctors eventually determined Wilson was living with schizoaffective disorder, a condition combining symptoms of schizophrenia with mood disorder symptoms including depression and mania. It explained the auditory hallucinations dating back to 1965. It explained the erratic behavior so many people, including Wilson himself, had misread for decades as simple eccentricity or drug-induced instability. The revelation reframed his entire adult life. He hadn't just been a fragile genius who cracked under pressure. He had been managing a serious, unnamed psychiatric illness since his early 20s, largely alone, while the people meant to help him either misunderstood the problem or actively exploited it. With an accurate diagnosis finally in place and Landy gone, Wilson slowly began rebuilding. Medication helped stabilize the symptoms that had gone untreated for so long. And in 1995, he married Melinda Ledbetter, a woman who would become, by his own repeated description, the most stabilizing force of his adult life. The years that followed would bring him back into public view more fully than anyone expected, culminating, decades later, in something few thought possible: the completion of the very album that had broken him in the first place. In 2004, 37 years after he walked away from it, Brian Wilson finally finished the album that had once broken him. Working with new collaborators and revisiting the original fragments alongside Van Dyke Parks, he completed and released it as Brian Wilson Present Smile. For an artist who had spent decades unable to even discuss the project publicly, associating it with trauma and personal failure, finishing it was less a creative comeback than an act of reclamation. Critics called it a triumph. For Wilson, by every account, it was something closer to peace with a wound he'd carried for half his life. The years that followed brought Wilson more stability than he'd known since before his first breakdown in 1964. Melinda Ledbetter, whom he credited with giving him the emotional security I needed to have a career, managed much of his daily life, shielding him from the kind of exploitation that had defined the Landy years. He toured again, performed Pet Sounds in full to standing ovations, and watched his story reach new audiences through the 2014 biopic Love and Mercy, which dramatized both his creative peak and his years under Landy's control. The genius the industry had once written off as too fragile to function was, improbably, thriving. That stability held for nearly 3 decades. Then, in January 2024, Melinda died. For a man whose entire adult recovery had been built around her steady presence, the loss was catastrophic in ways that went beyond grief alone. Within weeks, those closest to Wilson recognized that the daily structure holding his life together had disappeared along with her. His family filed for a conservatorship the following month, and court documents revealed something the public hadn't known. Wilson had been diagnosed with a major neurocognitive disorder, a form of dementia, and was already taking medication for it. He was, doctors noted, unable to fully provide for his own basic needs. A judge approved the conservatorship in May, appointing his longtime publicist and business manager as co-conservators, with evidence showing Wilson himself understood and consented to the arrangement. His final public appearance came a year later, at the premiere of a Disney Plus documentary chronicling the band he'd built from a Hawthorne garage. He couldn't join his surviving bandmates for the promotional tour beforehand, but he came to the premiere itself, and the standing ovation that greeted him lasted long enough that everyone in the room understood what it really meant. It wasn't applause for a single film. It was gratitude, offered while there was still time to offer it, for a body of work that had reshaped what pop music was allowed to be. Brian Wilson died on June 11, 2025, at 82, surrounded by the family who had spent his final year protecting him the way Melinda once had. His family's statement asked only for privacy, signed with the words from the film that had told his story to a new generation, Love and Mercy. The question that opened this documentary, how a man capable of hearing entire symphonies in his head could also be so vulnerable to the people and illnesses around him, was never really two separate questions. They were the same trait, viewed from opposite sides. The sensitivity that let him hear music no one else could was inseparable from the sensitivity that made the world so often too much to bear. That, in the end, may be the truest thing anyone said about Brian Wilson. The genius and the wound were never two different men.